Hello everyone, welcome back. And today we are going to discuss about top 5 best practices in Apex coding which can help you avoid common exceptions in Apex coding. There are many best practices which needs to be followed in Apex coding. In this video we will discuss top best practices which must be followed. These best practices are prioritized since we encountered them a lot of time. So let's move on. So the top one is avoiding SOQL statements in for loops, or in general any loop. We should not have SOQL statements in a loop. This is the topmost mistake to be avoided. Salesforce is a multi-tenant application or platform, as we know. You would have limited resources and there are rules in the form of Garner limits. What does Garner limits tell us? The Garner limits tells us that there can be 100 SOQL statements that can be run in asynchronous transactions, whereas for asynchronous transactions we can have 200 SOQLs. Now, how do we avoid this SOQLs in for loop? Of course, Salesforce provides collection variables. We can store the IDs, for example, in the form of sets, and we can use those set in the SOQL query. So instead of running the query again and again, we can run one query using the set variable. Now let's take a look at the examples. So we have one bad example here where the Apex code with SOQL query within the for loop, and a good example where an Apex code is having SOQL query outside the loop. So in the first example here, you can see we have a method get contacts, and it is accepting the accounts as input parameters, and while processing it is looping through the accounts and running a SOQL query here. So what happens when we receive more than 100 accounts as an input for this get contacts method? So it will end up running more than 100 SOQL queries, and this will result in too many SOQL queries exception. So let's go to the good example here. So in this case, as we discussed earlier, we are defining a set of account IDs. So what this will do, initially we will loop through all the accounts which are passed as input to this method get contacts, and we are storing all the IDs in the account IDs set. And finally, after the loop, we are running this query, and you can observe here we have a account ID as a filter. So this makes sure that there is only one SOQL run and the SOQL query is not in the loop. And when we take the count of SOQLs run in this method, it will be only one SOQL query. But in the bad example, there can be n number of SOQL queries depending on the number of accounts being passed to this method. Moving on to the next best practice, which is bulkification of code. In simple terms, this means that your code should handle multiple records at a time. So a non-bulkified code typically processes one record at a time, which can lead to hitting Garner limits. So when you have a bulkified code, it supports multiple record processing, it improves performance, and it helps in scalability of your code. Bulkification is a crucial concept in Salesforce to avoid hitting Garner limits and to ensure good performance and scalability. It ensures that the code runs within the Garner limits. Some errors which you may encounter without bulkification are too many SQL queries, too many DML statements, and also Apex CPU time limit exceeds. Now let's take a look at the example, a code without bulkification and a code with bulkification. So this is the example code where we are having an Apex code without bulkification. So in this example, as you can see, we have a for loop, and within this for loop, we have a SQL query which will run on the contact object. So this is a bad example. Again, this can hit the Garner limits. And whereas moving on to the good example, so in this example, again, we are following the same approach. We have a set defined and it will hold all the account IDs, and then we will run a query, a single query on the contact object, and then we perform the processing. So this is one good example for bulkification. This will avoid hitting the Garner limits. The one specific example that we are showing here is avoiding SOQL in the for loop. This is one of the Garner limits that can be avoided by using a bulkification code. The next best practice is usage of custom labels. We would have seen in many cases when the code is having hard-coded values, it is very awkward to look at the code with a hard-coded IDs or hard-coded record type names. So we should always avoid that, and we should use custom labels. And there are more examples why we need to use the custom labels. So it supports translation, which makes them ideal for multi-language organization. And maintainability. The hard-coded values make code difficult to maintain. That's because if a value changes, you have to modify the entire code. So reusability. When it comes to reusability, custom labels can be reused across multiple Apex classes, triggers, VF pages, LWCs. So don't you think this is one of the biggest advantage? They are flexible solution for constant values. It's same constant value everywhere without variation due to manual errors. Custom labels can add layer of security to your application by avoiding the exposure of sensitive default values in your code. The next best practice is about optimizing the SOQL query. We have seen the SOQL query to avoid in a for loop. Now we are discussing about how do we optimize the SOQL query. So there are many methods that we can optimize the SOQL query. The top ones are query only necessary fields that makes sure that the proper usage of resources are being done. And we can also use query filters. This is needed to make sure that we get only the records which are needed for processing. So why to get unnecessary records and spend more resources on them? It will improve the performance. It will make your code look more efficient. So SQL queries can enforce field and object level security permissions as well. And this is achieved using with security enforced clause. This feature ensures that the user's permissions and field level securities are respected, therefore improving the overall security of your data. Let's take a look at the examples. We have bad example where SQL query has multiple fields in it, but whereas we are using only one field in the processing. And the good example, that is the optimized SQL query. If you can see here, we have only one field which is required for processing, and the same has been used in the SQL query. So the last best practice in this video is having one trigger per object. So what does this mean? Salesforce, though it allows you to have multiple triggers on an object, but it recommends that we should always have one trigger per object. The reason for this is the order of execution. Salesforce doesn't guarantee any specific order of execution for triggers on the same object. If you have more than one trigger for the same object, you can't control the order in which they fire. And the next reason is testing and debugging. Imagine how difficult it would be to debug an issue when you have multiple triggers. So you should always avoid multiple triggers on the same object. The next reason is to avoid recursion. So what if an execution of one trigger causes invocation of another trigger? So when we have multiple triggers on the same object, it can cause recursion. So it is always better to avoid multiple triggers on the same object. Hope you like this video. Do like and subscribe to the channel.